Sarah Martinez adjusted the weight of her M249 light machine gun as she walked across the dusty training ground. The other soldiers watched her with curious eyes. Some whispered among themselves, pointing at her weapon choice. Most infantrymen carried the standard M4 carbine, lighter and easier to handle. But Sarah had chosen the heavy machine gun, and everyone wanted to know why. "Hey, Martinez," called out Sergeant Thompson from across the field. "You sure about that thing? It's going to slow you down in combat scenarios." Sarah turned toward him, her dark eyes steady and confident. She had heard this question dozens of times since joining the unit 6 months ago. The M249 weighed nearly 17 pounds when fully loaded, almost 3 times heavier than a regular rifle. But Sarah knew something the others didn't understand yet. "I can handle it, Sergeant," she replied calmly. "This weapon can provide covering fire that no rifle can match." The other soldiers exchanged glances. Private Johnson, a tall guy from Texas, shook his head. "That's a lot of weight to carry around. What happens when we need to move fast?" Sarah had grown up on a ranch in New Mexico, where she learned to shoot before she could ride a bike properly. Her father taught her that every weapon had its purpose, and the key was knowing when and how to use each one. The M249 could fire up to 850 rounds per minute, creating a wall of suppressive fire that could pin down enemies and protect advancing troops. "Speed isn't everything," Sarah answered. "Sometimes you need firepower more than mobility." Lieutenant Davis, their platoon leader, walked over to join the conversation. He was a young officer, fresh from military academy, and he relied heavily on his sergeants for practical advice. The upcoming deployment to Afghanistan would be his first real combat mission, and he wanted his team to be as effective as possible. "Martinez, I've been reviewing your training scores," he said, consulting his clipboard. "Your accuracy with the M249 is impressive, but I'm concerned about the tactical implications. In urban environments, we need soldiers who can move quickly between positions." Sarah respected Lieutenant Davis, but she could see he was thinking like a textbook, instead of considering real battlefield conditions. She had spent countless hours studying combat reports from previous deployments, learning about the challenges troops faced in Afghanistan's mountainous terrain and urban areas. "Sir, with respect, the M249 isn't just about individual mobility," Sarah explained. "It's about team effectiveness. When properly positioned, this weapon can control entire areas of engagement. It can suppress enemy positions while the rest of the squad advances or retreats safely." Corporal Williams, a veteran with 2 previous deployments, nodded thoughtfully. He had seen enough combat to understand that battlefield success often came down to having the right tool for the job, not necessarily the lightest or most popular one. "She's got a point, Lieutenant," Williams said. "I've seen situations where we could have used more sustained firepower. Sometimes you need someone who can lay down continuous fire for several minutes." But not everyone was convinced. Private Foster, who had been struggling with his own rifle qualification scores, seemed particularly skeptical of Sarah's choice. He had joined the army to prove himself, and seeing a female soldier confidently handling a weapon he wouldn't even attempt to carry bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "Easy enough to talk about in training," Foster muttered. "Real combat is different. When bullets start flying, that heavy gun is going to be a liability." Sarah heard the comment but chose not to respond directly. She had learned early in her military career that some people would only be convinced by actions, not words. Instead, she focused on her training, spending extra hours at the range perfecting her technique with the M249. The weapon required different skills than a standard rifle. The M249 used belt-fed ammunition, which meant Sarah had to master the art of changing belts quickly under pressure. She practiced until she could complete a belt change in under 10 seconds, even while wearing full combat gear and protective gloves. She also worked on controlling the weapon's recoil and managing its rate of fire. Unlike a semi-automatic rifle, the M249 could fire continuously, but that didn't mean it should. Sarah learned to fire in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, while maintaining effective suppression of targets. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed by everyone. Sergeant Thompson, despite his initial doubts, began to appreciate Sarah's commitment to mastering her chosen weapon. During squad exercises, He started positioning her in ways that took advantage of the M249's capabilities. Martinez, set up. On that ridge, he would call during training scenarios. Give us overwatch while we advance on the objective. Time after time, Sarah proved that her weapon choice wasn't just about personal preference. The M249's sustained rate of fire and longer effective range made it ideal for providing covering fire during squad movements. While other soldiers moved from position to position, Sarah could suppress enemy positions from a distance, allowing her teammates to advance safely. But challenges remained. The weapon's weight meant Sarah had to be in excellent physical condition. She spent extra time in the gym, focusing on building the strength and endurance needed to carry the M249 effectively during long patrols. Her fellow soldiers noticed her dedication, though not all of them understood or appreciated it. As their deployment date approached, the questions about Sarah's loadout became more frequent and more pointed. Some soldiers worried that her slower movement speed might compromise mission success. Others questioned whether she could maintain the weapon's effectiveness under the stress of actual combat. The doubt wasn't entirely unfair. The M249 was indeed a challenging weapon system that required significant training and physical capability to use effectively. Many soldiers who attempted to qualify with it during basic training struggled with its weight and complexity. But Sarah had invested hundreds of hours in mastering every aspect of the weapon, from basic maintenance to advanced firing techniques. Her confidence came from knowledge and preparation, not arrogance. She understood the weapon's limitations, as well as its advantages. In close-quarters combat, the M249 would indeed be less maneuverable than a rifle. But in many of the environments they expected to encounter in Afghanistan, the ability to provide sustained suppressive fire could mean the difference between mission success and failure. As the unit prepared for their final training exercises, before deployment, Sarah remained focused on her goal, proving that her unconventional choice was actually the right choice for the challenges they would face. She knew that soon enough the theoretical discussions would end, and real-world performance would be the only measure that mattered. 3 months later, Sarah found herself crouched behind a mud brick wall in the Helmand province of Afghanistan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty village, and the air was thick with tension. Intelligence reports had indicated Taliban fighters were using this area to store weapons and plan attacks on coalition forces. The village seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Local civilians had apparently evacuated the area overnight, which usually meant trouble was coming. Sarah checked her M249 one more time, ensuring the ammunition belt was properly seated and the weapon was ready for action. Lieutenant Davis was studying a map with Sergeant Thompson, planning their approach to the suspected weapons cache. The mission was straightforward. Search several compounds, gather intelligence, and destroy any weapons or explosives they found. What they didn't expect was the level of resistance they were about to encounter. Martinez, you'll provide overwatch from the eastern ridge, Lieutenant Davis instructed. Keep your eyes on those rooftops and the road leading out of the village. If anyone tries to flank us or escape, you stop them. Sarah nodded and began, making her way to the designated position. The M249 felt familiar in her hands now, like an extension of her own body. Months of training and preparation had built her confidence, but this would be her first real test in combat conditions. As she climbed the rocky slope to reach her overwatch position, Sarah could hear her teammates beginning their search of the first compound. Radio chatter was minimal, professional. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But Sarah had learned from veteran soldiers that plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy. From her elevated position, Sarah had an excellent view of the entire village. She could see her squad members moving methodically through the buildings, checking rooms and looking for anything suspicious. Through her weapon scope, she scanned the surrounding area for any signs of enemy activity. That's when she saw the first indication of trouble, movement on a distant rooftop about 400 meters away. Someone was positioning what looked like a heavy weapon, possibly a machine gun or rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Sarah immediately got on the radio. Overwatch to team leader. I have movement on the northern rooftop, approximately 400 meters from your position. Looks like someone setting up a crew-served weapon. Lieutenant Davis's voice crackled through the radio. Copy that, Martinez. Keep watching and report any changes. But Sarah could see that the situation was developing quickly. More figures appeared, on various rooftops around the village. This wasn't a simple weapons cache mission anymore. The squad was walking into a carefully planned ambush, and she was the only one who could see the full scope of the threat. Team leader, this is Overwatch. I count at least 8 hostiles taking positions on multiple rooftops. This looks like a coordinated ambush. Recommend immediate withdrawal to covered positions. Before Lieutenant Davis could respond, the first shots rang out. Automatic weapon fire erupted from 3 different directions, and Sarah watched as her teammates scrambled for cover. The Taliban fighters had waited until the squad was deep inside the village before opening fire, cutting off their most direct escape routes. Private Johnson dove behind a low wall as bullets kicked up dust around his feet. Corporal Williams dragged a wounded soldier into a doorway, calling for medical assistance over the radio. The squad was pinned down, taking fire from multiple elevated positions that gave the enemy significant tactical advantages. Sarah quickly assessed the situation. The enemy fighters were using their elevated positions effectively, firing down at her teammates who had limited cover in the narrow village streets. The standard infantry weapons her squad mates carried were effective at closer ranges, but they lacked the sustained firepower needed to suppress multiple enemy positions simultaneously. This was exactly the scenario Sarah had trained for. The situation where the M249's capabilities would prove their worth. While her teammates' rifles were excellent for precise semi-automatic fire, they couldn't maintain the continuous suppression needed to neutralize multiple enemy positions at once. Overwatch to all elements, Sarah called over the radio. I'm engaging northern rooftop positions. When you hear my fire, move to better cover. Sarah took a deep breath and acquired her first target. The fighter with the crew-served weapon was still trying to get his gun into position. Through her scope, Sarah could see him clearly. She centered her crosshairs and began firing controlled bursts. The M249's distinctive sound echoed across the valley as Sarah's rounds impacted the enemy position. The fighter with the heavy weapon went down, and his gun tumbled off the rooftop. But Sarah didn't pause to celebrate. She immediately shifted her fire to the next position, where 2 more fighters were shooting at her trapped teammates. The sustained firepower of the M249 had an immediate effect that individual rifle fire couldn't match. As Sarah's continuous bursts swept across the enemy positions, the Taliban fighters were forced to take cover instead of maintaining their aimed fire at the squad below. "Moving now," came Sergeant Thompson's voice over the radio, and Sarah could see her teammates using the suppression she was providing to reach better defensive positions. But the enemy had more fighters than Sarah had initially observed. As she engaged the northern positions, new shooters appeared on rooftops to the east and west. Her squad was still surrounded, and now the enemy knew exactly where Sarah was positioned. Bullets began impacting the rocks around Sarah's position as enemy fighters turned their attention toward her. She had to keep moving, changing positions frequently to avoid being targeted by the increasingly accurate enemy fire. But every time she moved, she lost precious seconds of suppressive fire that her teammates desperately needed. The weight of the M249 that her fellow soldiers had criticized now became both a challenge and an advantage. Moving quickly between positions was more difficult with the heavy weapon, but when Sarah did find good cover, she could deliver devastating firepower that kept multiple enemy positions suppressed simultaneously. "Overwatch, this is Team Leader," Lieutenant Davis called. "We're taking casualties down here. We need continuous suppression on those eastern positions so we can establish a casualty collection point." Sarah could see what he meant. Private Foster had been hit and was bleeding heavily. Corporal Williams was trying to provide medical aid, but every time he exposed himself to work on the wounded soldier, enemy fire forced him back into cover. "Copy that, Team Leader. Shifting fire to eastern positions now." Sarah swung her weapon toward the new threat, immediately engaging the fighters, who were preventing medical aid to the wounded soldier. Her sustained fire forced the enemy shooters to duck below the rooftop walls, giving Corporal Williams the precious seconds he needed to apply pressure bandages and start IV fluids. The battle was becoming a deadly chess match, with Sarah using her superior firepower to control multiple enemy positions, while her teammates tried to consolidate their defense and treat their wounded. But ammunition was becoming a concern. The M249 consumed rounds much faster than a standard rifle, and Sarah was already on her third belt of ammunition. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. Sarah had fired over 600 rounds in the past 20 minutes, and she could feel the weight of her remaining belts getting lighter. Each belt contained 200 rounds, and she had started the mission with 6 belts. Simple math told her she needed to make every shot count from here on, but the tactical situation was improving slightly. Her sustained suppressive fire had forced most of the enemy fighters to keep their heads down, reducing the volume of incoming fire on her pinned-down squad. Lieutenant Davis had managed to establish a small perimeter around the wounded, and Corporal Williams was doing his best to stabilize the casualties. "Overwatch to team leader," Sarah called. "I'm running low on ammo. Need to know the plan for extraction." "Working on it, Martinez. Air support is 15 minutes out. Can you hold until then?" Sarah did quick calculations in her head. 15 minutes of sustained fire would require at least 300 more rounds, possibly more if the enemy increased their activity. She had maybe 400 rounds left, so it would be close. But her teammates' lives depended on her maintaining fire superiority until help arrived. "Roger that, team leader. I can make it work." But as Sarah spoke those words, she spotted new movement that changed everything. A large group of fighters was approaching the village from the south, at least 20 or 30 additional enemy combatants. They were moving in tactical formation, clearly intending to reinforce the ambush and completely overwhelm the small American squad. This changed the entire dynamic of the engagement. Sarah's squad was already outnumbered and outgunned by the fighters already in the village. With 30 more enemies joining the fight, the situation would become hopeless very quickly. "Team leader, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on a large enemy force approaching from the south. Estimate 2 to 3 dozen fighters. ETA about 5 minutes to your position." The radio was quiet for several seconds before Lieutenant Davis responded. Sarah could hear the stress in his voice. "Copy that, Overwatch. We need to break contact now. Can you provide covering fire for a withdrawal?" Sarah studied the terrain between her squad's position and the nearest cover that could protect them from the approaching enemy force. It was almost 200 meters of open ground with very little concealment. Moving wounded soldiers across that distance while under fire would be extremely dangerous, possibly impossible. "Team leader, that's a lot of open ground to cover with wounded. The enemy has too many good firing positions overlooking your route." But, even as Sarah said it, she was formulating a different plan. The approaching enemy force was moving along a ridge line that would bring them directly past her position. If she could engage them while they were still in column formation, she might be able to disrupt their advance enough to buy her squad the time they needed to escape. It would be risky. Engaging 30 fighters with a single machine gun was not something any tactical manual would recommend, but Sarah realized she might be the only thing standing between her squad and complete annihilation. "Team leader, I have an idea. The reinforcements are moving along a route that will bring them past my position. If I can hit them while they're bunched up in column formation, I might be able to delay them long enough for you to get out." "Martinez, that's too dangerous. You'll be completely exposed." Sarah was already moving to a new position that would give her a clear field of fire on the approaching enemy column. The M249's bipod legs extended as she set up behind a boulder that provided good cover from the front but left her flanks exposed. "It's the only chance we have, sir. Once those reinforcements reach the village, we're all dead anyway." Through her scope, Sarah could see the enemy fighters moving confidently along the ridge trail. They clearly thought they were approaching a simple mopping-up operation, not expecting any resistance from their direction. Their formation was loose but predictable, perfect for a devastating flanking attack. Sarah waited until the lead elements of the enemy column were about 300 meters away, well within the M249's effective range. She had to time this perfectly, too early, and the rear elements could escape and still reinforce the village. Too late, and they would spread out, making her fire less effective. The first burst from Sarah's position came as a complete surprise to the enemy column. Her initial round struck the lead fighters, causing immediate chaos as the rest of the group scrambled for cover. But Sarah didn't give them time to organize. She walked her fire back along the column, forcing the enemy to spread out and take defensive positions instead of advancing. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. The enemy fighters had expected to arrive at an easy victory, not to be engaged by accurate, sustained machine gun fire from an unexpected direction. Several fighters began withdrawing back along the trail, unwilling to advance into Sarah's kill zone. But Sarah's aggressive action had a serious downside. By engaging the enemy column, she had revealed her position to all the fighters in the area. Now she was taking fire from multiple directions as enemy fighters in the village and on the ridge tried to eliminate the threat she represented. Bullets cracked past her position and chipped fragments from the rocks around her. Sarah had to keep moving, using short bounds between covered positions to avoid being pinned down herself. But every time she moved, she lost precious seconds of fire that allowed some enemy fighters to advance closer to her squad. Overwatch. This is team leader. We're moving now. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Sarah could see her teammates beginning their withdrawal, carrying their wounded and using whatever cover they could find. But they were still taking fire from the original ambush positions in the village, and some of the enemy reinforcements were still trying to advance despite her harassment. The next few minutes became a blur of controlled violence. Sarah fired, moved, fired again, constantly adjusting her position to maintain effective fire on multiple enemy groups while avoiding the increasing volume of fire directed at her. Her training took over completely as she executed the battle. Drills she had practiced hundreds of times. Belt changes became automatic, muscle memory taking over as Sarah kept the M249 firing almost continuously. The weapon's barrel was getting hot from sustained fire, but it was designed for exactly this type of engagement. Unlike a standard rifle, the M249 could maintain this rate of fire for extended periods without overheating. Through her scope, Sarah could see that her squad was making progress towards safety. They had covered about half the distance to the rally point, and the enemy fire from the village was decreasing as her suppression forced the fighters to keep their heads down. But her ammunition situation was becoming critical. Sarah was down to her last belt of ammunition, and she could see that some of the enemy fighters were beginning to figure out her pattern of movement. They were starting to anticipate where she would move next, pre-positioning to engage her new firing positions. Team leader, this is Overwatch. I'm down to my last belt. How much more time do you need? 5 more minutes, Martinez. We're almost to the extraction point. 5 minutes felt like an eternity when you're down to your last 200 rounds. Sarah made every shot count, firing only when she had clear targets and could achieve maximum effect. The M249's rate of fire was adjustable, and she had switched to a slower, more controlled pace to conserve ammunition while maintaining effective suppression. The enemy fighters were getting bolder as they realized her rate of fire had decreased. Several were attempting to flank her position, moving through the rocky terrain to get behind her. Sarah could see them advancing in short rushes, using natural cover to mask their movement. She was facing the classic dilemma of a machine gunner in an extended engagement. Stay in position and eventually be overrun, or keep moving and lose the ability to provide effective covering fire for her squad. Either choice could result in disaster for her teammates who were still moving wounded soldiers across difficult terrain. Sarah chose a third option that her training had prepared her for, but she had hoped never to use. She would establish a final defensive position and hold it as long as possible, giving her squad the maximum time to reach safety, even if it meant sacrificing her own chances of escape. The position she selected was a natural depression between 2 large boulders that gave her excellent fields of fire in multiple directions. It also meant she would be difficult to flank without exposing attackers to her fire. But once she committed to this position, there would be no further movement. This would be her last stand. Team leader, this is Overwatch. I'm setting up a final defensive position. Once you reach the extraction point, don't wait for me. Get those wounded out of here. Martinez, that's not happening. We don't leave people behind. Sarah appreciated Lieutenant Davis's loyalty, but she could see the tactical situation more clearly from her elevated position. Her squad was moving as fast as they could with wounded, but they were still vulnerable to pursuit. If the enemy fighters reorganized and mounted an effective chase, her teammates could still be caught in the open. Sir, with respect, your priority is getting those wounded to medical care. I can hold this position and prevent pursuit. That's what the M249 is for. Sarah settled into her final fighting position and began engaging the closest threats. A group of 5 fighters was attempting to move through a gully that would bring them within assault range of her squad. Sarah's sustained fire forced them to take cover, disrupting their advance and buying precious time. But ammunition was running critically low. Sarah counted her remaining rounds carefully, allocating them based on priority targets. Enemy fighters, who posed the most immediate threat to her withdrawing squad, received her full attention, while less dangerous targets were ignored to conserve ammunition. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance gave Sarah a surge of hope. Air support was finally arriving, though whether it would be in time to help her current situation remained to be seen. Attack helicopters would be able to engage the enemy positions that were beyond Sarah's range, but they would need time to assess the situation and identify targets. As the helicopters grew closer, Sarah used her radio to provide target information to the incoming aircraft. Her elevated position and familiarity with the enemy locations made her an ideal forward observer, even while she continued engaging immediate threats with her dwindling ammunition supply. Falcon Flight, this is Ground Observer. I have multiple enemy positions marked, requesting immediate close air support on targets around grid 1234-5678. The lead helicopter pilot responded immediately. Ground Observer, we have your position marked. Keep your head down, we're coming in hot. Sarah watched as the attack helicopters swept in low and fast, their cannons and rockets engaging the enemy positions that had been giving her squad so much trouble. The psychological effect on the enemy fighters was immediate and dramatic. Many abandoned their positions and fled rather than face the devastating firepower of the aircraft. But Sarah's immediate problem remained unchanged. She was still surrounded by enemy fighters and her ammunition was nearly exhausted. The helicopters could help with some targets, but others were too close to her position for safe engagement by aircraft. With less than 50 rounds remaining, Sarah had to make some difficult tactical decisions. She could no longer provide sustained suppressive fire against multiple targets. Instead, she had to pick her shots carefully, engaging only the most critical threats while allowing others to move freely. A group of 3 fighters was attempting to assault her position directly, moving up the slope toward her defensive position. These were the most immediate threat, and Sarah allocated half of her remaining ammunition to stopping them. Her accurate fire forced 2 to take cover, but the third continued advancing. Sarah switched to single shots, trying to make each round count. The advancing fighter was using good tactical movement, making himself a difficult target while continuing to close the distance. Sarah waited for him to expose himself fully before taking her shot. The round struck home, and the fighter went down. But Sarah's muzzle flash had given away her exact position, and now she was receiving concentrated fire from multiple directions. Bullets were impacting all around her position, forcing her to keep her head down. With only 20 rounds left, Sarah faced the reality that her weapon would soon be silent. But she could see that her squad had reached the extraction point, and medical evacuation helicopters were beginning to land. Her wounded teammates would receive the care they needed, and the mission, despite its challenges, would be considered a success. The sound of approaching footsteps told Sarah that enemy fighters were attempting a final assault on her position. She chambered her last belt of ammunition and prepared for close-range combat. The M249 might not be ideal for close-quarters fighting, but Sarah was trained in its use at all ranges. 3 fighters appeared over the ridge, moving toward her position in tactical formation. Sarah engaged them with short, precise bursts, using the last of her ammunition to defend her position. 2 went down immediately, but the third managed to get close enough to throw a grenade toward her position. Sarah rolled away from the explosion, her ears ringing from the blast. Her M249 had been damaged by shrapnel, and she could see it would no longer fire. But she still had her sidearm, and years of training had prepared her for exactly this situation. The surviving enemy fighter approached cautiously, apparently believing Sarah had been killed or wounded by the grenade explosion. When he appeared around the boulder, Sarah was ready for him. 3 precise shots from her pistol ended the immediate threat, but she could hear more voices approaching from different directions. Sarah quickly assessed her situation. Her primary weapon was destroyed, she was low on pistol ammunition, and she was surrounded by an unknown number of enemy fighters. But most importantly, her squad was safe. The wounded were being evacuated, and air support was available to prevent any organized pursuit. The radio crackled with Lieutenant Davis's voice. "Martinez, respond. What's your status?" Sarah keyed her radio one last time. "Team leader, this is Overwatch. Mission accomplished. All personnel accounted for and extracted. Don't worry about me, just make sure those wounded get proper medical care." Lieutenant Davis stared at the radio in disbelief. Sarah's transmission had ended abruptly, and subsequent attempts to reach her received no response. The medical evacuation helicopters were loading the wounded, and the attack helicopters continued, engaging enemy positions throughout the valley, but Sarah's fate remained unknown. "We're not leaving her," Davis told Sergeant Thompson as they watched the last wounded soldier being loaded onto the helicopter. "She's the reason we're all alive, right now." Thompson nodded grimly. He had seen enough combat to understand what Sarah had done for them. Her choice to establish a final defensive position had given them the time they needed to escape with their wounded, but it had also cut off her own avenue of retreat. The attack helicopters were systematically engaging every enemy position they could identify, but the terrain was complex, full of caves and hidden positions where fighters could take shelter from air attack. Sarah could be anywhere in that maze of rocks and gullies, either fighting for her life or already captured. "Falcon Flight, this is Ground Team Leader," Davis called to the helicopter pilots. "We have a missing team member, last known position grid, 1256-7834, request search and rescue support." The pilot's response was immediate. "Copy that, Ground Team. We'll expand our search pattern. Any idea of her current status?" Davis looked at the terrain where Sarah had made her last stand. Smoke was rising from several locations where rockets had struck enemy positions, and he could see bodies scattered on the slopes where Sarah's machine gun had taken its toll. But there was no sign of Sarah herself. Meanwhile, Sarah was very much alive, but in an increasingly desperate situation. The grenade explosion had left her partially deaf and disoriented, but she had managed to find cover in a narrow crevice between 2 boulders. Enemy fighters were searching the area methodically, calling to each other in Pashto as they tried to locate her. Sarah's pistol had 3 rounds remaining, hardly enough to fight her way out of the situation. But her training had covered scenarios like this, and she knew that survival sometimes required patience more than firepower. The key was to remain hidden until an opportunity for escape presented itself. The sound of helicopter rotors was getting closer, and Sarah could hear the distinctive whine of chain guns as the attack helicopters continued engaging enemy positions. Each explosion sent the searching fighters running for cover, disrupting their organized search and giving Sarah precious breathing space. Through a gap in the rocks, Sarah could see one of the helicopters making a low pass over her area. The pilot was clearly looking for survivors, but the terrain made it difficult to spot individual personnel from the air. Sarah needed to signal her location, without revealing it to the enemy fighters who were still nearby. Sarah had a signal mirror in her survival kit, a small piece of equipment that most soldiers carried but rarely used. By reflecting sunlight toward the helicopter, she might be able to attract attention without making noise that would alert the enemy to her position. The angle was difficult, requiring Sarah to expose herself partially to get the right reflection. She waited until the nearest enemy fighters had moved past her position, then carefully positioned the mirror to catch the sun's rays. The bright flash of reflected light lasted only seconds, but it was enough. "Ground Team, this is Falcon 2, came the radio call. I have a possible survivor signal from grid 1256-7832. Looks like someone with a signal mirror." Davis grabbed his radio immediately. "Falcon 2, that has to be Martinez. Can you confirm?" "Negative on confirmation, but someone down there is definitely trying to signal us. We're taking fire from multiple positions in that area, so extraction is going to be challenging." Sarah could hear the helicopters coordinating their attack, runs, systematically engaging the enemy positions that surrounded her location. But she also knew that close air support had limitations in terrain like this. There were too many places for fighters to hide, and too many blind spots where enemies could position themselves safely. As the helicopters worked to clear the area, Sarah used the noise and confusion to improve her position. She moved carefully, through the rocks, using natural cover to mask her movement while working toward an area where helicopter extraction might be possible. But the enemy fighters weren't giving up easily. They had realized that an American soldier was still alive, in their area, and they were determined to capture or kill her before she could escape. Sarah could hear them coordinating their search, moving in a systematic pattern that would eventually force her out of hiding. Sarah's radio crackled with a direct transmission from one of the helicopter pilots. "Survivor on the ground, if you can hear this. We need you to move to the clearing about 200 meters northeast of your current position. We can't extract you from where you are now. 200 meters might as well have been 2 miles. Between Sarah's current position and the clearing lay open ground, covered by multiple enemy positions. Moving across it would require perfect timing, and probably more luck than skill. But Sarah had noticed something about the enemy fighters' behavior. They were clearly afraid of the helicopters, taking cover immediately whenever the aircraft made attack runs. If she could time her movement to coincide with the helicopter attacks, she might be able to cross the open ground while the enemies were hiding. "Falcon Flight, this is the Survivor," Sarah transmitted on her radio. "I need you to make attack runs on the positions between my location and the extraction point. I'm going to move during your attacks." "Copy that, Survivor. Give us 30 seconds to set up, then start moving. We'll keep their heads down." Sarah prepared for what would probably be the most dangerous 200 meters of her life. Her damaged M249 was useless, but she still had her survival pack and her remaining pistol ammunition. Most importantly, she had the training and determination that had brought her this far. The helicopters began their attack run with a devastating display of firepower. Rockets and cannon fire swept across the enemy positions, forcing the fighters to take cover in whatever holes they could find. Sarah used the noise and confusion to begin her desperate dash toward the extraction point. She moved in short rushes, using whatever cover was available while trying to maintain a pace that would get her across the open ground before the helicopter attack ended. Behind her, she could hear voices shouting in Pashto as some of the enemy fighters realized what was happening. Bullets began cracking past Sarah's position as enemy fighters brave enough to expose themselves during the helicopter attack tried to stop her escape. Sarah returned fire with her pistol, not expecting to hit anything at that range but hoping to make the enemies more cautious about exposing themselves. The clearing was getting closer, but Sarah's strength was beginning to fail. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the battle was wearing off, and the physical demands of the day were taking their toll. Each bound towards safety required enormous effort, and she could feel her pace slowing despite the danger. "Survivor, you're almost there," came the pilot's encouraging voice over the radio. "We can see you moving 50 more meters." Sarah summoned her last reserves of energy for the final push toward the extraction point. Behind her, she could hear enemy fighters, organizing for a final attempt to stop her escape, but the